In the marble halls of Crestmoor Academy, a quiet janitor was about to face the cruelest humiliation of her invisible life. What started as routine morning cleaning took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a calculated prank designed to destroy her dignity in front of 300 witnesses. Maria Santos Alvarez wasn't your typical custodial worker. For 15 years, she had spent her life in the shadows of international intelligence operations, known for breaking codes that saved thousands of lives across multiple continents. When she encountered Lila Barnes' glitter water trap during the Fall Honors Assembly, she had no idea they were about to expose the cryptographic tattoo that marked her as one of only 6 members of the world's most classified task force. Maria's instinctive combat reflexes that would lead to a torn shirt, a revealed secret, and the complete transformation of everyone who had dismissed her as, quote, just the help. What began as teenage cruelty would become a reckoning with hidden heroism. The prestigious academy would never be the same after discovering that the woman they had bullied for months was actually a decorated intelligence operative whose classified work had prevented terrorist attacks and saved lives on every continent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Gothic spires of Crestmoor Academy like secrets refusing to surface, and Maria Alvarez moved through the marble corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being seen meant being vulnerable. At 5:47 a.m., 2 hours before the first privileged teenager would grace these hallowed halls with their presence, she pushed her cart through the silence, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Maria had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight during her 3 years at Crestmoor. She knew exactly which shadows to occupy, which corners provided the best vantage points for observing without being observed, and how to move through the school's social ecosystem without disturbing its delicate balance of entitlement and indifference. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her uniform crisp and clean despite its obvious wear, and her movements carried an efficiency that spoke of military precision, though no one at Crestmoor would have recognized it as such. The first anonymous note had appeared 6 months ago, tucked into her supply closet like a venomous snake coiled between the bleach and paper towels. Maybe if you spend less time pretending to read and more time actually cleaning, this place wouldn't smell like failure. It had read in the entitled scrawl of someone who had never doubted their place in the world. Maria had read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the small metal box she kept in her apartment, alongside 17 others that had followed. She never responded to the notes, never showed them to administration, never allowed her face to betray the flash of recognition when she caught glimpses of familiar handwriting on homework assignments or permission slips. Maria Alvarez had survived things that would break most people's minds, and the crude psychological warfare of overprivileged teenagers was nothing compared to the real battles she had fought in shadows most people couldn't imagine. But this morning felt different. As she methodically cleaned the trophy cases that displayed generations of Crestmoor excellence, lacrosse championships, debate victories, college acceptances to institutions where admission required both 7-figure donations and generational legacy, Maria sensed the subtle shift in atmosphere that preceded significant events. It was the same hypervigilance that had kept her alive in places where death wore friendly faces and spoke in coded language. The shift became tangible when Principal Everett Langston's voice echoed through the PA system at 7:15 a.m., his carefully modulated tones carrying the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. Good morning, Crestmoor family. Today marks the beginning of our new Excellence Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to elevate every aspect of our academic community. We will be implementing enhanced performance standards across all departments, ensuring that everyone who represents Crestmoor Academy meets our exceptional criteria. Maria paused in her polishing, her hand stilling on the glass case that held the school's first championship trophy from 1923. She understood bureaucratic doublespeak better than most, and Langston's announcement carried the unmistakable scent of impending change. Enhanced performance standards. Everyone who represents Crestmoor. The words were carefully chosen bullets, aimed with precision at targets the speaker couldn't name directly. By 8:30 a.m., the hallways began filling with the sounds of teenage entitlement, designer backpacks hitting lockers, conversations about weekend trips to family compounds in the Hamptons, and the casual cruelty that came as naturally as breathing to those who had never faced real consequences. Maria continued her work, moving through the crowd like a ghost, invisible to everyone except those who found sport in acknowledging her presence. "Oh my God, it's like she doesn't understand that normal people can smell her from here," Lila Barnes announced to her circle of followers, her voice pitched just loud enough to ensure Maria could hear every word. At 17, Lila had already mastered the particular brand of entitled cruelty that came with being Senator Claudia Barnes's daughter, a combination of political calculation and genuine malice that made her dangerous in ways her victims never fully understood. Lila's audience laughed with the practiced enthusiasm of professional sycophants, their voices creating a wall of sound that turned Maria's presence into a performance. She was mopping the floor near the main staircase, her movements steady and methodical, giving no indication that she heard or cared about their commentary. But in the periphery of her vision, she noticed a lone figure who wasn't laughing. Aiden Brooks sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, his scholarship students' carefully maintained uniform, marking him as different from his wealthy classmates in ways that only other outsiders would recognize. His dark eyes tracked the interaction with the analytical intensity of someone who understood what it meant to be marked as different, and when Maria briefly met his gaze, she saw something unexpected: respect. It was a small moment, lasting perhaps 3 seconds, but it carried weight that neither of them fully understood yet. Aiden had noticed things about the school's janitor that others missed: the way she moved with unconscious precision, how her eyes constantly scanned her environment with professional awareness, and most intriguingly, how she had been solving the New York Times Sunday crossword in the faculty lounge during her lunch break, finishing puzzles that stumped the English department in less than 10 minutes. "Are you even listening to me?" Lila's voice had risen to the pitch that meant someone wasn't providing the reaction she demanded, and Maria realized the performance required her participation. "I apologize if my presence is disturbing you, Miss Barnes," Maria replied in the careful tone she had perfected, respectful enough to avoid direct confrontation, but empty enough to provide no emotional satisfaction. "I'll finish cleaning this area and move on." The response was perfectly calculated to infuriate Lila, who thrived on emotional reactions and found Maria's composure more insulting than any direct challenge could have been. "Don't you dare talk to me like you're doing me some kind of favor," she snapped, her face flushing with the kind of righteous anger that came from never being denied anything. "You work for us. You're nothing but the help, and you should act like it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of assumptions and inherited cruelty. Maria absorbed them without visible reaction, but something shifted in her posture. A subtle straightening that spoke of inner steel forged in fires these children couldn't imagine. For just a moment, her eyes held a flash of something that made Aiden lean forward with sudden interest. Then it was gone, replaced by the same professional neutrality that had served Maria for 3 years. She finished mopping the area around Lila's feet with methodical precision, gathered her supplies, and moved on without another word. But the encounter had been witnessed by others, and in the complex social ecosystem of Crestmoor Academy, no interaction was ever truly private. Principal Langston observed the scene from the second-floor balcony, his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. At 52, Everett Langston had built his career on understanding power dynamics and managing public perception, skills that had served him well during his transition from Ivy League academia to private school administration. He saw Lila Barnes' performance not as bullying, but as a natural expression of the social hierarchy that kept institutions like Crestmoor functioning smoothly. Maria Alvarez was a problem that had been growing in Langston's peripheral vision for months. Not because she was incompetent. Her work was impeccable, and she never caused administrative difficulties, but because she represented the kind of complexity that didn't fit neatly into Crestmoor's carefully constructed image. Parents paid astronomical tuition to ensure their children were surrounded by excellence in all its forms, and a middle-aged janitor, who seemed to appear from nowhere, with no verifiable employment history, raised questions that Langston preferred not to answer. The Excellence Initiative provided the perfect cover for addressing such problems. Enhanced performance standards could be interpreted to mean anything, and if certain staff members found themselves unable to meet those elevated expectations, well, that was simply the natural result of pursuing true excellence. As the morning progressed and Maria continued her invisible navigation through Crestmoor's social minefield, she remained unaware that her carefully constructed anonymity was beginning to crack. 3 years of perfect invisibility had created its own kind of visibility, the attention that comes from being too consistent, too professional, too mysteriously competent for the role you're supposed to fill. In her apartment that evening, Maria sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea and the day's crossword puzzle, the only indulgence she allowed herself from her former life. The clues came together with the same mechanical precision that had once made her one of the world's most sought-after intelligence analysts, patterns forming and dissolving in her mind with mathematical beauty. But tonight, the familiar ritual felt different. As she filled in the final answer, camouflage, concealment by blending with surroundings, Maria found herself staring at the completed grid with a growing sense of unease. Camouflage worked only as long as the environment remained stable, and something fundamental was shifting at Crestmoor Academy. She rose from the table and walked to her bedroom closet, pushing aside the modest collection of uniforms and casual clothes to reveal a small metal box hidden behind a false panel. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, lay the remnants of a life she had deliberately abandoned. Military commendations, intelligence service awards, and photographs of faces she had once trusted with her life. At the bottom of the box, sealed in an envelope marked with warnings in 3 languages, was the documentation that explained the intricate tattoo covering her back, a cryptographic sigil known to fewer than 20 people worldwide, marking her as a member of an ultra-classified intelligence task force that had officially never existed. Maria touched the envelope but didn't open it. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, and she had chosen invisibility precisely because visibility had cost her everything that mattered. But as she replaced the box and returned to her kitchen table, she couldn't shake the feeling that choice was about to be taken away from her. The anonymous note waiting on her kitchen counter confirmed her instincts. This one was different from the others. Not the crude cruelty of teenage bullying, but something colder and more calculating. People are starting to ask questions about you, Maria. Maybe it's time to find a new job before we find the answers. The Fall Honors Assembly at Crestmoor Academy was an annual celebration of institutional self-congratulation, where students, faculty, and parents gathered in the mahogany-paneled auditorium to applaud their own excellence. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows that depicted scenes of academic triumph, casting rainbow patterns across faces that had never known real adversity. Maria worked methodically around the edges of the preparation, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every detail met the impossible standards that Crestmoor demanded. She had been cleaning since 4 a.m., moving through the auditorium like a shadow while the morning custodial staff prepared for the day's performance. The assembly was scheduled for 10 a.m., which gave her exactly enough time to finish the restrooms, replace the flowers in the faculty reception area, and disappear before the first families arrived. Maria had learned to time her work around Crestmoor's social calendar with military precision, understanding that her presence during official events would be seen as evidence of poor planning rather than dedication. But this morning, something felt wrong. It was the same sixth sense that had kept her alive during covert operations in places where paranoia was a survival skill, and as she organized her cleaning supplies in the backstage storage area, Maria found herself cataloging escape routes and defensive positions out of pure instinct. The first sign of trouble came at 9:15 a.m., when Lila Barnes arrived early with her usual entourage of followers. Maria was cleaning the backstage area where student speakers would wait before their presentations, hidden behind a rack of Honor Society banners, when she heard Lila's voice carrying that particular tone of excited malice that meant someone was about to suffer for her amusement. "This is going to be absolutely perfect," Lila was saying to her friend Jessica Morrison, whose father owned half of Boston's waterfront development. "I've been planning this for weeks, and with everyone's parents here, it's going to be completely humiliating. She won't be able to show her face here again." Maria froze, her cleaning cloth suspended halfway to the window she was polishing. Through a gap in the banners, she could see Lila examining something in her designer handbag, a small plastic container filled with what looked like glitter suspended in water. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Jessica asked, her voice carrying the nervous uncertainty of someone who enjoyed cruelty but lacked the courage to initiate it. "I mean, what if we get in trouble?" Lila's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Trouble? For what? It's just a harmless prank on the help. Besides, my mother chairs the board of trustees, and Principal Langston would never risk alienating her over something so trivial. The worst that happens is we get a lecture about respecting all members of the Crestmoor community, and then everyone forgets about it." Maria understood the plan with crystalline clarity. Lila intended to stage some kind of accident during the assembly that would result in Maria being doused with glitter water in front of the entire school community. It was psychological warfare designed to achieve maximum humiliation with minimum risk, the kind of calculated cruelty that came naturally to those who had never faced real consequences. For a moment, Maria considered her options. She could report the planned prank to administration, but that would require explaining how she had overheard it, and Principal Langston had made it clear that staff complaints about student behavior were viewed as evidence of inadequate professional boundaries. She could simply avoid the auditorium during the assembly, but that would mean abandoning her duties and potentially providing Langston with grounds for disciplinary action. Or she could do what she had always done, accept the attack, endure it with dignity, and continue her work with the knowledge that her enemies had revealed their intentions while she had maintained her cover. The choice was made for her when Ms. Caroline Wentworth, the senior English teacher, appeared in the backstage area looking for extra chairs. Ms. Wentworth was one of the few faculty members who had ever spoken to Maria with genuine courtesy, and her presence meant that Maria couldn't retreat without abandoning her post. "Oh, Maria, perfect timing," Ms. Wentworth said, her voice warm with the kind of respect that came from recognizing competence regardless of its packaging. "Would you mind helping me move these chairs to the main area? We're expecting a larger crowd than usual, and I want to make sure everyone has a seat." "Of course, Ms. Wentworth," Maria replied, setting down her cleaning supplies and moving to help with the chairs. As they worked together, she caught glimpses of Lila and her friends positioning themselves near the main aisle, their expressions bright with anticipation. The assembly began with the traditional pomp that Crestmoor had perfected over more than a century of operation. Principal Langston took the podium in his perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming under the auditorium lights as he welcomed the assembled crowd of students, faculty, and parents. The audience was a study in understated wealth, designer clothes that whispered rather than shouted their cost, jewelry that could finance small countries, and faces that carried the confidence of people who had never questioned their place in the world. Maria positioned herself in the side aisle, ready to address any needs that might arise during the ceremony. She had learned to make herself available without being intrusive, a delicate balance that required constant attention to social cues and unspoken expectations. As Langston began his opening remarks about excellence and tradition, she noticed Aidan Brooks sitting in the scholarship students section, his eyes tracking her movement with the same analytical intensity she had observed before. The ceremony proceeded through its familiar rhythms. Academic achievements were celebrated, athletic victories were commemorated, and the families of Crestmoor's elite applauded their own success with practiced enthusiasm. Maria remained invisible, moving only when necessary, and maintaining the professional neutrality that had protected her for 3 years. The moment came during the presentation of the Dean's List, when students were called to the stage to receive recognition for their academic excellence. Lila Barnes was among those honored, her smile radiant, as she accepted her certificate and posed for photographs with her parents. Senator Claudia Barnes sat in the front row, her political instincts evident in the way she managed her public image even during a private school ceremony. As the honored students returned to their seats, Lila made her move with the precision of a predator who had studied her prey. She approached Maria with a concerned expression, her voice loud enough to attract attention from nearby parents. "Excuse me, there's been a spill in the ladies' room," Lila announced, holding up the container of glitter water in a way that made it look like evidence of some cleaning emergency. "Could you please take care of it right away? My mother is Senator Barnes, and she has several important donors here today." The request was perfectly calculated to put Maria in an impossible position. Refusing would be seen as insubordination, but accepting meant walking directly into Lila's trap. Maria understood the game being played, but she also understood that her role required her to play it. "Of course, Miss Barnes," Maria replied, moving toward Lila with the same professional composure she had maintained for 3 years. "I'll take care of it immediately." What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of moments that divide life into before and after. As Maria reached for the container, Lila executed her planned stumble with theatrical perfection, the glitter water flying in a perfect arc that would have drenched Maria from head to toe in front of 300 witnesses. But Maria's reflexes were not those of a career janitor. They were the reflexes of someone who had survived ambushes in places where hesitation meant death, and as the container flew toward her, she moved with unconscious precision to minimize the damage, The water caught her on the shoulder and chest, soaking through her uniform shirt and causing her to stumble backward into the row of chairs behind her. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the sudden silence like a gunshot. Maria's shirt had caught on the metal chair frame and ripped along the shoulder seam, exposing a portion of her back that she had kept hidden for 3 years. For one frozen moment, the entire auditorium saw what Maria Alvarez had never intended anyone at Crestmoor Academy to see. The tattoo was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Not the decorative flourishes or meaningful quotes that marked most people's body art, but something that spoke of a different world entirely. The exposed portion showed intricate geometric patterns interwoven with symbols that seemed to shift and flow even as observers tried to focus on them. It was clearly part of a larger design, and even this glimpse carried a weight of significance that silenced the crowd. Aiden Brooks sat forward in his seat, his analytical mind processing what he was seeing with growing amazement. The symbols weren't random. They formed a pattern that spoke of mathematical precision and deep meaning, the kind of cryptographic artistry that appeared in intelligence textbooks and classified documents. Ms. Wentworth's hand went to her throat, her academic background in literature and symbolism allowing her to recognize the tattoo's significance even if she couldn't decode its meaning. This wasn't decoration, it was documentation, proof of membership in something that existed far beyond the walls of Crestmoor Academy. Principal Langston's face had gone pale as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. For 3 years, he had dismissed Maria Alvarez as a simple custodial worker with no relevant history, but the tattoo told a different story entirely. It spoke of security clearances and classified operations, of a background that would require investigation and explanations that he was not prepared to provide. But it was Thomas Reed, the board member and retired military officer sitting in the 3rd row, who understood exactly what he was looking at. His face went white as recognition hit him like a physical blow, and his hand instinctively moved to his chest where his own service medals rested beneath his civilian clothes. The tattoo belonged to a world he knew intimately, and its presence on the back of Crestmoor's Janitor meant that everything he thought he knew about the school's staff was wrong. Maria herself stood frozen in the center of the auditorium, her professional composure finally cracking as 3 years of careful anonymity disappeared in an instant. The wet shirt clung to her skin, outlining the full extent of the tattoo that covered her back, and she could feel hundreds of eyes studying markings that had once been classified at levels most people couldn't imagine. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the Fall Honors Assembly at Crestmoor Academy became something else entirely, the moment when a carefully constructed fiction met unavoidable truth, and the collision changed everything for everyone involved. Lila Barnes stood at the center of the chaos she had created, her expression shifting from triumphant satisfaction to growing uncertainty as she realized that her perfectly planned humiliation had revealed something far more significant than she had intended. The glitter water dripped from her hands onto the polished floor, and for the first time in her privileged life, she began to understand that some games carried consequences she had never considered. The aftermath of the assembly spread through Crestmoor Academy like a virus, infecting every conversation and transforming Maria Alvarez from invisible janitor to the subject of fevered speculation. By lunch period, 36 cell phone photos of her exposed tattoo were circulating through encrypted messaging apps, each image analyzed and enhanced by students who had never considered the possibility that their school's most overlooked employee might harbor secrets that exceeded their wildest imagination. Aiden Brooks had skipped his AP history class to spend the period in the library's computer lab, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the focused intensity of someone who had stumbled onto the mystery of a lifetime. The symbols he had glimpsed during the assembly were burned into his memory with photographic clarity, and every search brought him closer to answers that seemed to exist in the shadowy spaces between official history and classified reality. Cryptographic sigils, he muttered to himself, scrolling through declassified intelligence documents that had been released under Freedom of Information Act requests. Task force identifications. Holy shit. The last phrase escaped him in a whisper that carried more awe than profanity, because what Aiden was discovering challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The symbols on Maria's back weren't random artwork or personal expression. They were documentation of membership in intelligence operations, so classified that their existence was acknowledged only in heavily redacted documents released decades after their completion. 3 floors below Aiden's feverish research, Janice Mulrooney held court in the main office, with the kind of gossipy authority that comes from controlling information flows in small communities. As the school's senior administrative assistant, Janice had perfected the art of knowing everything about everyone while maintaining plausible deniability about how she acquired her knowledge. "I'm telling you, there's something seriously wrong with that woman," Janice announced to the gathering of support staff that had formed around her desk like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "I mean, who gets a tattoo like that? It looked like something from a government conspiracy movie." Her audience nodded with the enthusiasm of people who had found validation for suspicions they had never quite been able to articulate. Maria's competence had always seemed excessive for someone in her position, her efficiency too perfect, her background too clean. Now, with the evidence of the tattoo spreading through the school's social media networks, their unease had crystallized into something approaching fear. "Maybe she's in witness protection," suggested Carol from the registrar's office, her voice carrying the breathless excitement of someone who had found drama in her otherwise mundane existence. "Like maybe she testified against the mob or something, and now she's hiding out here." "Or she could be a spy," added Marcus from maintenance, his imagination fired by the previous night's Netflix binge. "Like a sleeper agent waiting for activation. I always thought it was weird how she knew so much about the building's security systems." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Janice absorbed these theories with the calculating expression of someone who understood that information was power, and power required careful management. As the conversation continued around her, she made mental notes about which details to emphasize when she briefed Principal Langston, and which theories might prove useful for shaping the narrative that would ultimately determine Maria's fate. Meanwhile, in the faculty lounge, Miss Caroline Wentworth sat alone with her afternoon coffee and the printouts she had retrieved from her personal files. 23 years of teaching at prestigious institutions had given her access to research databases and academic networks that most people never encountered, and what she had discovered about cryptographic tattoos had left her profoundly unsettled. The symbols she had seen on Maria's back appeared in exactly 3 declassified documents, each one heavily redacted and marked with security classifications that indicated their original contents had been beyond top secret. The references were fragments, mentions of operational identifiers and task force sigils, but they painted a picture of intelligence operations so sensitive that their participants had been marked with permanent identification that existed outside normal bureaucratic channels. Caroline had taught enough military academy graduates to recognize the signs of combat experience, and now that she thought about it, Maria's behavior carried all the markers of someone with extensive tactical training. Her awareness of exits and angles, her ability to move silently through crowded spaces, her unconscious habit of positioning herself with clear lines of sight to potential threats, behaviors that Caroline had previously attributed to simple competence, now took on ominous significance. The question that haunted her was simple. If Maria Alvarez was qualified for the kind of operation suggested by her tattoo, what was she doing working as a janitor at a private school? Principal Everett Langston wrestled with the same question from his office on the 3rd floor, where he had spent the afternoon fielding phone calls from board members, parents, and a journalist from the Boston Globe, who had somehow already learned about the morning's incident. The Excellence Initiative that he had announced with such confidence now seemed like a relic from a simpler time, when his biggest concern was managing the delicate egos of wealthy donors, rather than explaining why his school employed someone with apparent intelligence community connections. The call from Senator Lila Barnes had been particularly difficult. Lila's mother possessed the politician's gift for turning personal embarrassment into righteous indignation, and she had made it clear that Maria's continued employment at Crestmoor represented both a security risk and a public relations disaster. "I don't care what kind of sob story she might have," Senator Barnes had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her problems solved by other people. "My daughter was assaulted by a potentially dangerous individual, and I expect immediate action to ensure the safety of all our children." The characterization of Lila's prank as an assault requiring protection from Maria would have been laughable under normal circumstances, but Langston understood that circumstances were no longer normal. The tattoo had transformed Maria from a simple personnel problem into something far more complex, and complexity was the enemy of the clean narrative that institutions like Crestmoor required to function. As the afternoon wore on, the whispers and speculation began to coalesce into something approaching consensus. Maria Alvarez was dangerous, her background was suspect, and her continued presence at the school represented an unacceptable risk to the community's safety and reputation. But not everyone had reached the same conclusion. Thomas Reed sat in his downtown law office, staring at a photograph that had been classified for 37 years. The image showed a group of intelligence operatives receiving commendations for their role in preventing what would have become one of the century's worst terrorist attacks. And, in the back row, barely visible behind the shoulders of her male colleagues, stood a young woman whose face Thomas recognized, despite the decades that had passed. His hands shook as he opened the sealed file that contained information about Operation Nightfall, the covert mission that had saved his daughter's life when she was serving as a cultural attaché in Prague. The official records credited anonymous intelligence assets with providing the warnings that prevented Amanda Reed's assassination, but Thomas had used his military connections to learn the truth. Maria Alvarez hadn't just been present for Operation Nightfall. She had been its architect, the cryptanalyst, whose decoding of intercepted communications had exposed the plot and made the rescue possible. The tattoo on her back was proof of membership in a task force so classified that Thomas himself had never been cleared to know its full scope, but he knew enough to understand that anyone bearing that sigil had earned it through service that exceeded normal comprehension. The woman who cleaned Crestmoor's floors had once held security clearances at levels that cabinet members envied, and her decision to disappear into anonymous manual labor suggested either a cover identity so deep that it boggled the mind, or trauma so severe that she had chosen invisibility over recognition. As the sun set over Boston's skyline, Thomas Reed made a decision that would change everything for everyone involved. He reached for his phone and dialed a number that connected him to networks most people didn't know existed, prepared to confirm what he already suspected about the school's most underestimated employee. In her small apartment across the city, Maria Alvarez sat at her kitchen table with the evening's crossword puzzle, her hands steady despite the earthquake that had shaken her carefully constructed world. The shirt she had worn during the assembly lay in her laundry basket, the torn shoulder seam serving as a reminder that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually demanded their due. She had felt the shift in atmosphere during her afternoon work, the subtle changes in behavior that indicated her cover was compromised beyond repair. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms, eyes followed her movements with new intensity, and the invisible barriers that had protected her for 3 years were dissolving like morning mist. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Maria understood that her choice was no longer between visibility and anonymity. The tattoo had made that decision for her, exposing truths that would require explanations she wasn't prepared to give, and consequences she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. But tonight, she would complete her crossword puzzle and prepare for whatever came next, because Maria Alvarez had survived much worse than the curiosity of privileged teenagers and the suspicions of school administrators. The final clue read, hidden in plain sight, 10 letters. The answer, of course, was camouflage. But as Maria filled in the letters, she realized that her camouflage had finally failed, and tomorrow would require her to remember who she had been before she became invisible. The mahogany conference table in Crestmoor Academy's boardroom gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as Principal Everett Langston shuffled through personnel files with the detached efficiency of a man performing surgery on strangers. The monthly faculty meeting had taken an ominous turn when board member Victoria Ashworth raised the dreaded topic of operational efficiency. Budget constraints required difficult decisions, Langston announced, his Harvard MBA training evident in every calculated syllable. We need to evaluate all non-essential personnel. His manicured finger traced down a list of names, pausing deliberately at one entry. Maria Alvarez, custodial staff. There have been concerns about her conduct and professionalism. Around the polished table, department heads exchanged glances. Dr. Margaret Phillips from the science department shifted uncomfortably in her chair, remembering how Maria had quietly fixed her broken microscope last week without being asked. But no one spoke. The unwritten rule at Crestmoor was simple. Don't rock the boat that carried your career. What kind of concerns? Miss Carolyn Wentworth asked from the corner, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence like a blade. The English department chair had been teaching at Crestmoor for 15 years, long enough to recognize bureaucratic doublespeak when she heard it. Langston's smile was practiced and cold. Student complaints, parent feedback, questions about her, background. You understand, Caroline. Image is everything in our position. The truth, which hung unspoken in the air like smoke, was far simpler. Senator Lila Barnes had made 3 phone calls in the past week. Each conversation had been brief, polite, and absolutely clear in its implications. Maria Alvarez had become a liability to her daughter's reputation, and liabilities needed to be eliminated with surgical precision. Performance review, Langston declared, making a notation in Maria's file. Effective immediately. 2 weeks to show improvement in all measurable areas. The phrase measurable areas was institutional code for, "We've already decided, but we need documentation for legal protection." Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the school's basement, Maria stood in the dim storage room that served as her office, staring at a small wooden box hidden behind industrial cleaning supplies. The metal lock had remained untouched for 3 years, but tonight her fingers traced its familiar edges like a rosary. Inside lay remnants of a life she'd deliberately buried, medals she'd never worn publicly, commendations written in languages most people couldn't identify, and photographs of men and women whose faces would never appear in obituaries. The knock on her office door was gentle but persistent. Maria quickly slid the box back into its hiding place before opening the door to find Aiden Brooks standing in the hallway, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something approaching desperation. "Mrs. Alvarez," he began, then stopped, searching for words that seemed inadequate. "I heard what happened in the faculty meeting. My mom works in the administrative office, and she told me about the review." Maria's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes shifted. "Young man, you shouldn't concern yourself with adult matters. Focus on your studies." "But it's not fair," the words burst from Aiden with teenage passion. "You do more for this school than half the people they're protecting. I've seen you stay late to help the night security guard when his arthritis flares up. I've watched you fix broken equipment that maintenance supposedly couldn't repair. And now they're targeting you because some spoiled brat can't handle consequences." For the first time in months, Maria's carefully constructed mask slipped. The woman who emerged in that moment wasn't the humble janitor who absorbed insults like a sponge. This was someone who had once made decisions that altered the course of international incidents, someone who had carried secrets that could topple governments. "Aiden," she said quietly, and her voice carried an authority that made him stand straighter. "Some battles aren't worth fighting. Some truths are too expensive to speak." But even as she spoke, Maria felt something awakening in her chest. It wasn't anger. Anger was unprofessional and counterproductive. It was something colder and more precise, the same calculating fury that had driven her to work 18-hour days decoding intercepted communications while bombs fell around her forward operating base. 3 doors down the hall, Ms. Wentworth was having her own revelation. She'd spent the evening researching cryptographic symbols, following a thread that began with Aiden's nervous questions about military insignia. What she'd discovered in declassified intelligence documents made her hands shake as she reached for her phone. The call to Thomas Reed was answered on the second ring. Reed, a decorated Army colonel turned successful businessman, served on Crestmoor's board, primarily to honor his late daughter's memory. She had died in a classified operation overseas, one that had never made the news but had earned several unknown heroes medals they would never be allowed to display. "Caroline, it's late. Is everything all right?" "Thomas, I need you to see something. Can you meet me at the school in an hour?" "It's about Maria Alvarez, and I think we've all made a terrible mistake." The anonymous message appeared in Aiden's inbox at 2:47 a.m., sent from an encrypted account that would disappear within hours. The sender identified himself only as Granite 6, but his credentials were immediately apparent in the precise military terminology and classified knowledge he displayed. "Son, that symbol you posted belongs to someone with clearance levels that officially don't exist. Task Force Cypher dissolved in 2021, but their work saved lives on every continent. If the person carrying that mark is pushing a mop, either she's deep undercover or she's been forgotten by people who should damn well remember. That tattoo represents 6 individuals worldwide. 6. Think about that number, then think about what kind of person ends up invisible in plain sight. Some heroes don't wear capes. They wear silence like armor. Be careful who you trust with this information, and be more careful who you don't." Aiden stared at his laptop screen until his eyes burned, then printed the message before it could vanish into digital oblivion. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed against his chest like a physical force. Maria Alvarez wasn't just hiding from something. She was someone whose very existence had been classified at levels that made top secret look like public information. At 7:30 a.m., he found her in the main hallway, methodically mopping the marble floors while students streamed past like she was invisible furniture. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the small section of her shoulder where the mysterious tattoo lay hidden beneath her uniform shirt. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said quietly, approaching with the reverence reserved for war memorials, "we need to talk." Maria looked up, and for just a moment, her eyes held the same calculating assessment he'd seen in documentary footage of special operations soldiers. Then the mask slipped back into place. "I told you, young man, some things are better left alone." "Task Force Cipher," Aiden whispered, and watched Maria's grip tighten on the mop handle. "6 people worldwide. Granite 6 says hello." The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The humble janitor vanished, replaced by someone whose presence suddenly filled the entire hallway. Students passing by unconsciously gave her a wider berth, sensing something predatory in her stillness. "Where did you hear that name?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the same authority that had once coordinated international intelligence operations. "Someone who knows what that tattoo means. Someone who says you saved his life even though he never met you." Aiden pulled out the printed message, hands shaking slightly. "Mrs. Alvarez, who are you really?" Maria read the message in seconds, her trained mind automatically assessing threats and calculating responses. The mention of being forgotten hit like a physical blow, because it was true. After the task force was dissolved and its members scattered to civilian lives, she had chosen anonymity over recognition, peace over purpose. "I'm someone who made too many hard choices," she said finally. "Someone who decided that knowing how to break enemy codes wasn't worth the nightmares anymore. Someone who thought cleaning floors might clean her conscience." 20 miles away, Thomas Reed was having his own crisis of recognition. He sat in his home office, surrounded by military memorabilia and photographs of a daughter who would never come home, staring at the image Ms. Wentworth had forwarded to his phone. The cryptographic sigil burned in his memory like a brand. He remembered a classified briefing in 2019 when a colonel with haunted eyes had described a joint intelligence operation that had prevented a terrorist attack on American soil. The operation had been successful because someone, a ghost in the intelligence community, had broken an impossible code in less than 6 hours. The colonel had mentioned a task force of 6 individuals whose identities were so classified that their successes could never be publicly acknowledged. "The Cipher Unit," Reed whispered to the empty room. "Jesus Christ, she's one of the Cipher Unit." His daughter, Captain Sarah Reed, had died in Syria, but not before her unit had extracted 17 civilian hostages from a compound surrounded by enemy forces. The extraction had been possible only because someone had decoded intercepted communications and provided precise intelligence about guard rotations, weapon placements, and escape routes. Someone whose work was so classified that she'd never received credit for saving those lives. Reed reached for his phone with shaking hands. As a board member, he had the authority to call emergency meetings. As a father who had lost his daughter to a classified war, he had the moral obligation to ensure that heroes were recognized rather than humiliated. "Langston? It's Thomas Reed. We need to convene the board immediately. And I mean immediately." The emergency board meeting was called for 6 p.m., but by 5:30, word had leaked through the Academy's gossip network with the efficiency of wildfire. Students lingered in hallways, sensing the electric tension that preceded institutional earthquakes. Faculty members found excuses to work late, positioning themselves within earshot of the boardroom. Lila Barnes arrived with her mother in tow, Senator Claudia Barnes having rearranged her schedule to personally ensure that this ridiculous situation was handled with appropriate discretion. The senator's definition of discretion involved strategic phone calls to key board members and subtle reminders about political contributions and school funding. "This is a tempest in a teapot," Senator Barnes declared to the assembled board, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. A disturbed janitor with a suspicious tattoo, being enabled by a student with an overactive imagination. The solution is simple: terminate her employment and move forward. Principal Langston nodded enthusiastically, already composing the press release that would frame Maria's dismissal as a necessary security measure. He had spent the afternoon constructing a careful narrative about proper vetting procedures and the school's commitment to student safety. Then Thomas Reed stood up. At 6 feet 2 inches with silver hair and the bearing of a career military officer, Reed commanded attention simply by existing. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of combat experience and personal loss. "Before we proceed," he said, placing a manila folder on the conference table, "I believe the board should review some additional information about Miss Alvarez." "Thomas, really," Senator Barnes interrupted with practiced dismissiveness. "We don't need to drag this out with unnecessary." "Maria Santos Alvarez," Reed continued, his voice cutting through the senator's objection like a blade through silk. "Former Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Intelligence. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Purple Heart recipient. Member of Joint Task Force Cipher, from 2018 to 2021. The room fell silent. Even Lila, who had been checking her phone with teenage indifference, looked up with sudden attention. Reed opened the folder and began distributing photographs and documents. Task Force Cipher was a joint international intelligence unit comprised of 6 individuals selected from the world's most elite code-breaking and cryptanalysis programs. Their work prevented terrorist attacks in 14 countries, disrupted international arms trafficking networks, and saved an estimated 4,000 civilian lives. Senator Barnes's face had gone pale, but her political instincts kicked in immediately. Even if this is true, it doesn't change the fact that proper procedures weren't followed. Security clearances, background checks, were completed at levels far beyond anything required for civilian employment, Reed interrupted. Ms. Alvarez holds security clearances that officially don't exist. Her background checks were conducted by agencies that can't be named in open session. The boardroom door opened quietly, and Maria entered. She had changed from her janitor's uniform into a simple black dress, but something fundamental had shifted in her bearing. This wasn't the invisible woman who had absorbed months of casual cruelty. This was someone who had once briefed generals and spoken directly to presidents. "Members of the board," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I've been asked to address the concerns about my employment and background." Quote, Langston leaned forward, still clinging to his narrative of institutional authority. "Ms. Alvarez, while we appreciate your service, the irregularities in your hiring process were necessitated by national security protocols," Maria interrupted, and something in her tone made Langston shrink back in his chair. When Task Force Cipher was dissolved, its members were given new identities and placed in civilian positions that would provide psychological distance from classified operations. This placement was coordinated with federal agencies that I cannot name in this setting. She looked directly at Senator Barnes. "Your daughter's harassment of me wasn't just schoolyard bullying, Senator. It was targeting a federal asset whose mental health was considered vital to national security interests." The senator's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her political instincts completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. Lila, meanwhile, was experiencing her own crisis of comprehension. The woman she had humiliated, whose dignity she had attacked for entertainment, whose very existence she had dismissed as irrelevant, was describing a background that read like something from a thriller novel. "I don't believe it," Lila said weakly, but her voice lacked conviction. "This is all fake, staged." Reed reached into his folder and withdrew a photograph. Maria, in military dress uniform, standing beside men and women whose faces had been digitally obscured for security reasons. The insignia on her uniform, the ribbons on her chest, the unmistakable authenticity of the image made denial impossible. "Ms. Barnes," Reed said gently, "your daughter has spent months bullying a woman whose work saved my daughter's life. Captain Sarah Reed died in Syria, but not before extracting 17 hostages from a terrorist compound. The extraction was successful because Ms. Alvarez had decoded communications that provided vital intelligence about enemy positions." The room fell into complete silence. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Maria looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes with steady composure. "I chose to work here because I wanted to contribute to young people's futures in a quiet way. I thought my past was buried deeply enough that it wouldn't matter. I was wrong." Quote. The story broke at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, when investigative journalist Patricia Cortez received an anonymous tip about a decorated intelligence officer working as a janitor at an elite prep school. By Wednesday morning, the janitor hero was trending on every social media platform, and news vans were circling Crestmoor Academy like sharks sensing blood in the water. Senator Lila Barnes's first instinct was damage control. She placed urgent calls to media contacts, attempting to frame the story as a security breach rather than a human interest piece. Her second instinct was to blame others, specifically Principal Langston, whose mismanagement had allowed the situation to escalate beyond control. "This is exactly the kind of administrative incompetence that parents pay to avoid," she declared to a hastily assembled crisis management team. The school failed to properly vet their employees, failed to maintain appropriate security protocols, and failed to protect our children from exposure to potentially unstable individuals. But the narrative was already beyond her control. The photograph of Maria in her military uniform had gone viral, accompanied by testimonials from military personnel who recognized the significance of her service record. A retired Army general posted a video explaining the importance of Task Force Cypher's work, carefully avoiding classified details while making clear that Maria's contributions had been immeasurable and invaluable. The petition demanding Maria's reinstatement and formal recognition reached 100,000 signatures in 6 hours. Principal Langston, meanwhile, was discovering that institutional authority meant nothing when faced with genuine moral outrage. His carefully crafted press release about security procedures was torn apart by reporters who had done their homework. His attempt to schedule a controlled media appearance backfired when a veteran journalist asked pointed questions about the school's bullying policies and administrative accountability. "So you're saying," the journalist pressed, "that for 8 months your institution allowed a decorated war hero to be systematically humiliated by students and staff, and your response was to place her on performance review?" Langston's rehearsed talking points dissolved under scrutiny. "We had no way of knowing. Proper channels weren't followed. Security protocols require." Quote, "Did you ask her about her background before assuming she was unqualified for employment?" That is, we follow standard hiring procedures." "Did any of your standard procedures involve basic human decency?" The interview ended with Langston's political career effectively terminated, and Crestmoor Academy facing the kind of public relations disaster that usually required congressional hearings to resolve. At her small apartment in Riverside, Maria watched the coverage with a mixture of awe and horror. The attention was everything she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. Every news report felt like another layer of carefully constructed privacy being stripped away. The knock on her door at 3 p.m. was gentle but unmistakably official. Dr. Adrian Choi stood in her hallway, looking exactly as she remembered from their last classified briefing. Sharp suit, kind eyes, and the bearing of someone who carried state secrets like other people carried grocery lists. "Hello, Ghost," he said, using her old task force call sign. "I came as soon as I heard." Maria stepped aside to let him enter, her mind automatically cataloging potential surveillance threats and escape routes. Old habits died hard, especially when old colleagues appeared without warning. "Adrian, how did you find me?" "Same way I've been keeping tabs on all 6 of you for the past 3 years, he replied, settling into her kitchen chair with familiar ease. "The dissolution of Cypher didn't end our obligation to ensure your welfare. We'd been maintaining discreet oversight, making sure you were adjusting to civilian life." "You've been watching me?" The question carried a hint of the old Maria, the one who had once coordinated intelligence operations across multiple continents. "Protecting you," he corrected. "All of you. Do you have any idea how many foreign intelligence services would pay millions to know where the Cypher team ended up? Your decision to disappear into plain sight was strategically brilliant, but it required ongoing support." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Commendations that were never formally presented. Recognition that was classified at levels above presidential knowledge. "The work you did in Afghanistan alone saved 4 American bases from coordinated attacks." Maria stared at the documents, her trained mind processing the implications. Why now? Why reveal this? "Because heroes shouldn't die in anonymity," Adrian said quietly. "And because that 17-year-old girl who's been tormenting you? She needs to understand that strength comes in forms she never imagined." Across town, Lila Barnes was experiencing her own reckoning. The girl who had spent months treating Maria like a contemptible servant was now reading military citations that described intelligence work critical to national security and, quote, instrumental in preventing catastrophic loss of life. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Every cruel joke, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual cruelty now carried the weight of cosmic irony. She had been bullying someone whose work had literally saved lives, possibly including the lives of people she knew and cared about. The social media response was brutal and immediate. #JanitorJustice hashtags accompanied screenshots of Lila's Instagram posts, creating a narrative of entitled privilege attacking humble heroism. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages ranging from disappointed to threatening. But the comment that broke her came from an unexpected source. Aiden Brooks had posted a simple statement on the school's forum. "Maria Alvarez taught me that dignity isn't about what people think of you, it's about what you know about yourself. She carried secrets that could have made her famous, but she chose to carry mops instead because she thought service mattered more than recognition. The rest of us spent months proving we weren't worthy to clean her boots." The post had been shared 2,000 times in 4 hours. At 8 p.m., Maria's phone rang. The caller ID showed only a number, but she recognized the prefix of a government exchange. "Ms. Alvarez, this is David Morrison, Chief of Staff for the Senate Intelligence Committee. We'd like to extend an invitation for you to speak at our Veterans Recognition Ceremony next month. The committee feels your story represents the kind of quiet heroism that deserves national recognition." Maria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity crumbling around her. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the gesture, but I chose civilian life for specific reasons." "We understand your desire for privacy," Morrison continued. "But sometimes individual preferences have to be balanced against broader social good. Your story has already inspired legislation about veteran employment assistance and anti-bullying measures in educational institutions. Your voice could help ensure that other veterans don't face similar treatment." After ending the call, Maria sat in her kitchen and contemplated the locked box that had remained hidden for 3 years. Tomorrow, she would need to decide whether Maria Santos Alvarez, former ghost operative turned invisible janitor, was ready to become visible again. Outside her window, news vans continued their vigil, waiting for the woman who had spent her career in shadows to step into the light. The auditorium of Crestmoor Academy had never felt smaller. What was designed to hold 800 people now seemed intimate and charged with the kind of electricity that precedes historical moments. Founders Day traditionally celebrated the school's prestigious heritage with speeches from distinguished alumni and carefully choreographed presentations about academic excellence. This year, the program had been hastily revised to include a speaker who had never graduated from any prestigious institution, never held a corporate title, and never appeared on any social register. Maria Santos Alvarez stood in the wings, watching Principal Langston deliver opening remarks to a crowd that included local media, curious parents, and students who had never seen their janitor as anything more than mobile furniture. She wore a simple navy blue dress and, for the first time in 3 years, the small silver pin that identified her as a recipient of the intelligence community's highest honor, an award so classified that its very existence was denied by official sources. Miss Caroline Wentworth, now serving as interim principal after Langston's hasty resignation, approached with the careful reverence of someone handling historical artifacts. "Maria, you don't have to do this. The attention, the questions afterward, we can cancel if you're not ready." "I've been ready for 3 years," Maria replied quietly, her eyes fixed on the crowd. "I just didn't know it yet." In the audience, Thomas Reed sat in the front row beside his wife, both of them understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Behind them, Dr. Adrian Choi had taken a discreet seat near the exit, his presence both protective and supportive. Scattered throughout the auditorium were faces Maria recognized. Aiden Brooks in the student section, looking nervous and proud. Ms. Wentworth's colleagues from the English department, maintenance staff and cafeteria workers who had shared quiet moments with her during long shifts. And in the third row, looking smaller than she had ever appeared before, sat Lila Barnes beside her mother. Senator Claudia Barnes had initially planned to boycott the event, but political calculations had convinced her that absence would appear worse than attendance. Her daughter, meanwhile, was experiencing the kind of internal collapse that accompanies the complete destruction of one's understanding of the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ms. Wentworth announced from the podium, "it is my honor to introduce Maria Santos Alvarez." The applause was uncertain at first, tentative clapping from people who weren't sure what they were witnessing. But as Maria walked across the stage with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command, the sound grew stronger, more confident, building to something approaching reverence. She stood at the podium for a long moment, her eyes sweeping across faces that had been part of her daily landscape for 8 months. When she finally spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the auditorium without amplification, the result of years spent briefing rooms full of military officers and intelligence analysts. 3 years ago, I made a decision that probably saved my life, she began. I decided to become invisible. The auditorium fell completely silent, the kind of quiet that accompanies moments when everyone present realizes they are witnessing something that will be remembered and retold for decades. I had spent 15 years in the shadows of international intelligence work, carrying secrets that weighed more than the buildings around us. I had decoded messages that prevented terrorist attacks, coordinated operations that saved lives, and worked with allies whose names I can never speak publicly. When that career ended, I discovered that coming home from a war that officially never existed was harder than fighting in it. Maria's fingers moved unconsciously to her shoulder, where the cryptographic sigil lay hidden beneath her dress. So I chose to disappear in plain sight. I took a job that would make me invisible, working among people who would never ask questions about my past because they assumed I had no past worth questioning. I thought anonymity would heal me. I thought if I scrubbed floors long enough, I might scrub away the nightmares. Quote. In the audience, several veterans nodded with recognition. The experience Maria described, the difficulty of transitioning from critical importance to civilian obscurity, was shared by thousands of men and women who had served in classified capacities. What I discovered instead was that invisibility is its own kind of prison. When you're invisible, people feel free to treat you as less than human. They make assumptions about your intelligence, your worth, your dignity. They forget that the person cleaning their workspace might have once coordinated operations that kept them safe while they slept. Lila Barnes was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she confronted the magnitude of her casual cruelty. Every dismissive comment, every moment of ridicule, every assumption about Maria's intelligence and worth was being revealed as not just wrong, but grotesquely, historically wrong. Maria looked directly at the students section, her gaze encompassing not just Lila, but every young person who had participated in or witnessed her humiliation. I want you to understand something about strength, she continued, her voice growing more powerful. Real strength isn't about commanding attention or demanding respect. It's about maintaining your dignity when others try to strip it away. It's about continuing to serve even when your service isn't recognized. It's about carrying secrets that could make you famous and choosing instead to carry mops because you believe in the value of honest work. She paused, reaching up to unpin the brooch that held her dress closed at the shoulder. As the fabric fell away slightly, the intricate tattoo became visible to the entire auditorium, not just the partial glimpse that had started this journey, but the complete cryptographic sigil that identified her as one of 6 individuals worldwide who had achieved the highest levels of intelligence community recognition. This mark, she said, turning so everyone could see the full symbol, represents work that I can never fully describe, operations that officially never happened, lives saved by people whose names will never appear in history books. It represents 15 years of service to a country that asked me to remain anonymous so that you could remain safe. The applause began slowly, a single person clapping in the back of the auditorium. Then another joined, and another, until 800 people were on their feet delivering a standing ovation that seemed to shake the building's foundation. The sound continued for nearly 5 minutes, wave after wave of recognition and respect, washing over a woman who had spent months absorbing contempt and indifference. When the applause finally died down, Maria looked out at the crowd, with eyes that held both strength and infinite sadness. I want to thank the people who treated me with kindness when they thought I was nobody special. Mr. Rodriguez from maintenance, who shared his coffee during night shifts. Mrs. Chen from the cafeteria, who always saved me the last apple turnover. Dr. Phillips, who said good morning like she meant it, even when no one else was listening. She found Aiden in the crowd and smiled. And especially Aiden Brooks, who saw worth in someone everyone else had dismissed. Who investigated and questioned and refused to accept that surface appearances told the whole story. Young man, you have the instincts of a natural intelligence analyst, and I hope you use them to make the world a little more just. Finally, inevitably, her gaze found Lila Barnes. The girl who had been her primary tormentor was barely recognizable, her usual confidence replaced by something approaching devastation. "And to those who treated me as less than human," Maria said gently, "I want you to know that I forgive you. Not because your actions were acceptable, but because holding on to anger would make me less than the person I choose to be. Use this experience to become better people. Use it to look more carefully at those you might dismiss. Use it to remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about." Lila Barnes stood up in the middle of the auditorium, her voice shaking but audible to everyone present. "Mrs. Alvarez, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to... I can't." She broke down completely, the weight of her shame overwhelming her ability to articulate the depth of her regret. Maria stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage, looking directly at the girl who had made her life miserable for 8 months. "Lila," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the silent auditorium, "your apology is accepted. Now the question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? How are you going to use this experience to become someone worthy of the privileges you've been given?" Quote, the standing ovation that followed lasted another 10 minutes, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just recognition for Maria's service. It was a community acknowledging its own failures and committing to transformation. 2 weeks after the Founders' Day speech, Maria found herself in the familiar setting of the Academy's boardroom, but this time as an invited guest rather than a subject under review. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces that looked at her with respect rather than dismissal. Thomas Reed sat at the head of the table, flanked by Ms. Wentworth and 3 new board members who had been hastily appointed after the resignations that followed the media firestorm. "Maria," Reed began, "we've asked you here to discuss a proposal that we hope addresses both the school's needs and your unique qualifications. We want to create a position that has never existed at Crestmoor, Director of Student Mentorship and Community Integration." Maria listened as Reed outlined a comprehensive program designed to identify and support students who felt marginalized, overlooked, or misunderstood. The position would involve individual counseling, group workshops, and coordination with veteran organizations to provide alternative perspectives on strength, service, and character. The program would also include a scholarship fund, Ms. Wentworth added, specifically for children of veterans and first responders. "We want to ensure that service families have access to the educational opportunities they've sacrificed to protect." The irony wasn't lost on Maria. 3 weeks earlier, she had been mopping these same halls while being treated as invisible. Now she was being offered the authority to reshape the culture that had dismissed her. "What about custodial work?" she asked, surprising everyone in the room. "I'd like to continue those responsibilities as well." Reed looked puzzled. "Maria, with respect, you'd be significantly overqualified for maintenance duties. The mentorship position alone justifies a salary that—" "Mr. Reed," Maria interrupted gently, "for 3 years, custodial work has been my meditation, my way of staying grounded in simple, honest labor. Taking care of physical spaces teaches you to take care of people. I'd like to continue both roles, partly because the work itself has value, and partly because I never want to forget what it feels like to be overlooked." Quote, the board members exchanged glances, recognizing wisdom in an approach that challenged every assumption about prestige and hierarchy. "Additionally," Maria continued, "I'd like the mentorship program to partner with existing veteran support organizations. There are thousands of former service members struggling with civilian transitions, and many of them have skills and perspectives that could benefit young people. We could create a network where military experience becomes a resource for character development rather than just job training." Over the following months, the Maria Santos Alvarez Veterans Mentorship Program began taking shape with the efficiency of a military operation and the compassion of someone who understood both triumph and struggle. The first cohort included 15 students, some scholarship recipients from military families, others like Aiden Brooks, who had demonstrated exceptional character despite not fitting traditional leadership molds. Lila Barnes was among the first to volunteer for the program, a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. The girl who had once treated service as something to be mocked now spent afternoons learning about the psychological costs of classified operations and the challenges faced by veterans returning to civilian life. "I don't understand how you can forgive me," Lila said during one of their individual sessions, tears still coming easily months after the revelation. "What I did, the things I said, if I had known, "But you didn't know," Maria replied patiently, "and that's exactly the point. We make judgments about people based on surface appearances, assuming we understand their stories when we've only seen the final chapter. Your mistake wasn't unique, Lila. It was just visible enough to teach everyone a lesson." The transformation extended beyond individual relationships to institutional change. Ms. Wentworth, now permanently installed as principal, implemented mandatory bias training for all staff and students. The curriculum included modules on recognizing hidden strength, questioning assumptions, and understanding the diverse forms that service and sacrifice could take. Principal Langston, meanwhile, had resigned in disgrace and taken a position with a consulting firm specializing in crisis management, a career change that everyone agreed was probably inevitable. The program's first major success came when Aiden Brooks received a full scholarship to Georgetown University's Intelligence Studies program, accompanied by a summer internship with the State Department's Analytical Division. Maria had written his recommendation letter, describing his natural ability to see beyond surface presentations and identify hidden truths, skills essential for intelligence analysis and critical for human decency. "You changed my life," Aiden told her during their final mentoring session before his graduation. "Not just by teaching me about intelligence work, but by showing me that real strength is quiet, consistent, and focused on serving others rather than promoting yourself." Maria smiled, remembering her own mentors from the early days of her military career. "The best teachers don't change lives, Aiden. They just help people discover strengths they already possessed." As the school year ended, Maria received a letter that made her hands shake as she opened it. The return address bore the seal of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the contents were signed by the director himself. "Ms. Alvarez, your work at Crestmoor Academy has not gone unnoticed within the intelligence community. The mentorship program you've developed represents exactly the kind of innovative approach to character development that our nation needs. We would like to invite you to consult on a new initiative designed to identify and cultivate ethical leadership among young Americans. This would not require you to return to classified work, but rather to use your experience in developing programs that could be implemented in schools and universities nationwide. The goal is to create a generation of leaders who understand that true strength comes from service, rather than self-promotion. Your country has not forgotten your contributions, and we hope you have not forgotten your obligation to continue serving in whatever capacity brings you peace." Maria set the letter aside and looked out her office window at students walking across the campus courtyard. Among them, she spotted Lila Barnes helping a younger student with a heavy backpack, and Aiden Brooks explaining something to a group of freshmen with patient enthusiasm. The seeds were already planted. The question now was how far she was willing to let them grow. 1 year later, Maria Santos Alvarez walked through the halls of Crestmoor Academy with the measured pace of someone comfortable in her own skin. She wore simple slacks and a blue blouse, her custodial cart replaced by a worn leather messenger bag containing mentorship files, veteran outreach materials, and the occasional intelligence community newsletter that still found its way to her despite her civilian status. The morning routine had evolved, but maintained its essential character. She still arrived early, still walked the empty corridors in contemplative silence, still found peace in the simple act of ensuring that learning spaces were ready for the day's challenges. The difference was that students now stopped to greet her. Faculty members sought her advice on difficult cases, and parents regularly thanked her for programs that had transformed their children's understanding of character and service. Mrs. Alvarez. The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, a sophomore whose father had died in Iraq when Marcus was 8 years old. He was one of the scholarship recipients from the Veterans Families Program, and his transformation over the past year had been remarkable. "I finished the essay you suggested about my dad's service. Would you have time to read it?" Maria smiled, accepting the carefully typed pages. "Of course, Marcus. Are you still planning to apply for the summer program at the National Security Archive?" "Yes, ma'am. Thanks to your recommendation letter. I never thought I'd be interested in intelligence history, but after learning about your work, well, it made me realize that my dad's service was part of something bigger than I understood." This was the daily miracle that made Maria's transition from shadow operations to visible mentorship feel like a natural evolution rather than a dramatic change. Young people who had grown up seeing military service as abstract heroism were learning to understand it as complex human experience involving sacrifice, moral ambiguity, and the long-term costs of protecting others. Her office, formerly a converted supply closet, now expanded into a proper counseling space, had become an unofficial headquarters for what students had begun calling the Underground Railroad of Second Chances. Kids who felt overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed by traditional academic measures found their way to Maria's door, drawn by stories of her own invisibility and eventual recognition. Today's first appointment was with Jennifer Walsh, a senior whose military family had moved 17 times during her high school years. Jennifer struggled with forming lasting relationships and had developed a defensive cynicism that kept classmates at arm's length. "I don't see the point in getting close to people," Jennifer explained during their session. "We always move. I always start over. It's easier to just not connect." Maria nodded with understanding born from personal experience. "I spent 15 years moving between classified assignments, never staying anywhere long enough to form real relationships. I thought it made me stronger, more professional. What I discovered was that isolation doesn't protect you from pain. It just guarantees that you'll face pain alone." "But you chose to isolate yourself after leaving the military," Jennifer pointed out. "You worked as a janitor specifically to avoid connections." "And look how well that worked out," Maria replied with gentle humor. "I spent 3 years trying to disappear, and all I accomplished was proving that you can't hide from yourself. Real strength isn't about avoiding vulnerability, Jennifer. It's about choosing when and how to be vulnerable in ways that serve something larger than your own comfort." These conversations, multiplied across dozens of students throughout each week, represented the true measure of Maria's transformation from ghost operative to visible mentor. She was no longer protecting national security through code breaking and intelligence analysis. Instead, she was building human security through empathy and understanding. The knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Ms. Wentworth appeared, looking slightly nervous despite their year-long working relationship. "Maria, there's someone here to see you. She didn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." The visitor was a girl Maria didn't immediately recognize. Slight build, dark hair, nervous energy that suggested either excitement or terror. Then the young woman spoke, and Maria's world shifted again. "Mrs. Alvarez, my name is Rebecca Morrison. My older sister was Captain Sarah Reed, Thomas Reed's daughter, the one who died in Syria." Maria's breath caught. She had never met any family members of the soldiers whose lives had been affected by her intelligence work, but she remembered the Syrian operation clearly. The hostage extraction that had succeeded because she had decoded enemy communications in less than 6 hours, providing precise information about guard rotations and safe approach routes. "Rebecca," Maria said carefully, "I'm honored to meet you, but I'm not sure what." "I'm applying to West Point," Rebecca interrupted, her words coming in a nervous rush. "I want to serve like Sarah did, but my parents are terrified. They've already lost one daughter to military service, and they can't understand why I'd choose to follow the same path." She pulled out a worn photograph showing 2 young women in casual clothes, arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling with the unconscious confidence of people who believed they were invincible. "Sarah used to tell me stories about guardian angels, intelligence officers who worked in shadows to keep soldiers safe. She said she could do her job because she knew there were people like you making sure she had the information she needed to bring everyone home alive." Maria stared at the photograph, seeing in Rebecca's face an echo of the determination that had once driven her own decision to serve in classified capacities. "What do you want from me, Rebecca?" "I want you to help me convince my parents that military service can be about more than just putting yourself in danger. Sarah always said the real heroes were the people who prevented conflicts, rather than just fighting in them. I want to be like you. Someone who protects people in ways they never know about." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered topics Maria had never expected to discuss with a civilian: the psychological costs of classified work, the challenge of serving without recognition, the way that protecting others' ignorance of danger was itself a form of sacrifice. When Rebecca finally left, Maria sat alone in her office contemplating the circular nature of influence and inspiration. Her work had helped save Sarah Reed's life long enough for Sarah to complete her mission and inspire her younger sister. Now Rebecca was asking for guidance in following a path that would eventually lead to protecting other soldiers, other families, other young women whose names Maria would never know. As evening approached, Maria made her traditional final walk through the academy's halls. The building was largely empty except for custodial staff completing their shifts. People whose work, Maria now understood, was every bit as essential as code breaking or intelligence analysis. Near the main entrance, she encountered the bronze plaque that had been installed 6 months earlier as part of the school's commitment to recognizing previously invisible contributions. Strength doesn't always wear a title. Wisdom doesn't always carry credentials. Service doesn't always seek recognition. This institution is built upon the contributions of all who work within these walls, regardless of the visibility of their roles or the volume of their voices. In honor of Maria Santos Alvarez and all who serve in shadows, the plaque had been Lila Barnes' idea, proposed during a student council meeting and supported unanimously by both students and faculty. Lila, now a senior, had spent the past year volunteering with veteran organizations and planned to study international relations in college with the goal of joining the diplomatic corps. "I want to serve my country," she had told Maria during one of their sessions, "but I want to do it in a way that prevents conflicts instead of just managing them after they happen. You showed me that the most important battles are often fought by people whose names never appear in newspapers." As Maria prepared to leave the building, her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Adrian Choi. "The new Veteran Mentorship Pilot Program has been approved for implementation in 50 schools nationwide. They want you to head up the training curriculum. Interested in saving the world one teenager at a time?" Maria looked around the empty hallway one more time, remembering the woman who had walked these same floors in custodial uniform, absorbing contempt and ridicule while carrying secrets that could have commanded worldwide respect. That woman had been hiding from herself as much as from others, using invisibility as armor against the psychological costs of a classified career. The woman who stood here now understood that true invisibility was impossible and ultimately counterproductive. Real strength came not from hiding in shadows, but from choosing when to step into light in ways that illuminated paths for others. She typed her response to Adrian, "Send me the details. Some work is too important to remain invisible." Outside, the sun was setting over Crestmoor Academy, casting long shadows across the courtyard, where students learned daily lessons about character, service, and the hidden strength that exists in every person willing to look beyond surface appearances. In 12 hours, Maria would return to begin another day of mentoring, teaching, and quietly revolutionary work. The janitor they had bullied had revealed her true identity not through the tattoo on her shoulder, but through the gradual transformation of everyone whose life she touched. And that, she thought as she walked to her car, was exactly the kind of mission she had been trained for all along. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.